Hi knitting friends, Shaina Bilow here. In today's video, I'm going to demonstrate how to work a 3-needle bind off and pick up the stitches off of a provisional cast on for this sweater. So I'm using 2 strands of yarn and I've got a lot of needles here. So I knit this sweater on a size 7. I have a size US 7 needle right here that I'll be using for the bind off. And then I actually have a 5 and a 6 here to pick up the shoulder stitches on. The reason I'm using a smaller needle is because they're easier to weave into the stitches and fit in there. And also sometimes we don't have 3 pairs of the same size needle. If you happen to have 3 size 7 or whatever needle you made your project on needles, go for it, use them. But it is actually easier to wiggle in a skinnier needle into these stitches than it is to use the same needle from your project. So as long as you work the bind off on your working needle, you should be fine. So I'm going to use 1 needle for the front shoulder stitches, both the right and the left front shoulders, and 1 needle for the back shoulder stitches. Let's begin. Here I have the front stitches, and what I'm doing is I'm starting at the edge of the work and I'm going into the right leg of every stitch here. So starting right at the edge, I'm going into the first row of stitches that's just below my provisional cast on, which you can see in that bright blue, and I'm picking up the right hand leg of the V. So if stitches look like little letter V's, my needle is going underneath the right leg of the V and scooping up just the right leg, and then I'm going over the left leg. I'm skipping over the left leg. And we're going to do that across the shoulder stitches here, the left front shoulder stitches that I'm scooping up under. So I secure these stitches onto my knitting needle first before I take out the provisional cast on. So I'm securing these stitches here under the right leg only of the stitch. That way it'll be seated on the needle correctly. Here's my last stitch, and that's the first edge. So now I've got all these stitches here, and I'm going to unravel the provisional cast on. So I had made a crochet chain provisional cast on. I'm undoing the chain at the end, and then everything just comes right out. Depending on the provisional cast on you used, you may have to do something different to get it out. Maybe you have to cut the provisional yarn, your waste yarn. But here we go. I've gotten that out. And now sometimes you'll notice this little extra loop on the edge of the work. That's because by nature, provisional cast-ons have a half stitch off on each side. So that's what that little loop was. I'm now going to go across the right front shoulder stitches in the same way. Speed it up a little for you here. And right here at the end, same thing. I always check my ends after I remove the provisional cast on to make sure that I've gotten all the stitches. But here we go, I'm removing this provisional cast on. And so both my right and left front shoulder stitches are on the same needle in this case. I like to just get everything done at once. Here again is that loopy stitch at the edge. If you're nervous about that, what you can do is put a stitch marker on it, a lock ring stitch marker. And then later on, if you think you have one less stitch or something, you can use that as a stitch in your 3-needle bind off. All right, so that's secure there, just in case. And we'll connect it later if we need to, but you'll see. So I've gotten my front stitches on the needles. Now I'm going to put the back stitches on the other set of needles. And generally speaking, I use circular needles for everything, so you know, I'd recommend those to you here too. So I'm getting all of these stitches on the needle the same way I did for the other 2 shoulder stitches. Here we go. Removing the provisional cast on. And you'll notice here on this side, one of my stitches sticks. I accidentally caught the yarn on a stitch, so this is why we use scrap yarn. I'm just going to cut that away. No problem. Just snip that strand and get that out of there. Fabulous. Now we're ready for the 3 needle bind off to begin. So I have the right sides of my pieces facing me. I am now going to take one of the pieces and sandwich it on top of the other so that the right sides are facing one another. This way, after I've worked the seam, when I flip the piece right side out, the seam is on the inside. Okay, so you want your fronts of the sweater, the outsides of the sweater, to be sandwiched together. All right, here we go. We're going to slide these stitches up to the tips of the needle, and with your working yarn and your working needle in the right hand, or however you knit, the working needle in the right hand and the yarn however you knit, you are going to begin the 3 needle bind off by working into the first stitch on each needle as follows. So I'm going to insert my working needle into the first stitch on the front needle and the first stitch on the back needle, like so. Then I'm going to attach my yarn for knitting around the right hand needle and bring that new stitch that I just knitted through the first stitch on each needle, and then remove both of them from the left hand needles, their respective left hand needles. Let's do that again. Into the first stitch on the front needle, then into the first stitch on the back needle. Wrap your yarn for knit around the right hand needle, and of course it's a little loose here when we begin. Wrap the yarn for knit. At the end we will tidy that all up. Then bring the new stitch through the back stitch and through the front stitch before taking each of those stitches off of their respective needles. Now this is called the 3 needle bind off because we also need to work in a bind off here. So after combining the first 2 stitches on each needle, we then bind off the stitch that is on the right hand needle. So we bind one off. So now I'm going to combine the first stitch from each needle again, work those 2 together, wrap the yarn, come on out of stitch number 2 and then stitch number 1, or back stitch and front stitch, and simultaneously bind off. All right, so first stitch on each needle, wrap the yarn, then come out of those stitches. And you can come up with, if you have a smooth way of getting into both of them all at once and coming out of both of them at once, do that. You don't have to make it a choppy, very step-by-step thing. You can just smoothly get into both stitches if you're comfortable with that, as long as you feel good about that. Then wrap your yarn for knit. Once you're in the stitches, come on out of the 2 stitches, take them each off, and bind off. There's a lot going on here. You have a lot of needles, so just be sure that as you're taking the stitches off the left-hand needles that you're careful not to drop anything, and that as you're binding off on the right-hand needle that you're also not dropping anything. All right, but that's the idea. So knit the first stitch on each needle together with the right-hand yarn, also being careful not to be too tight about your bind off, because you do want a bit of a comfortable, flexible seam that matches the elasticity of your fabric. All right. Two together and then bind off. 2 together, then bind off. And here I'm showing you in continental stitch now. My yarn is in my left hand. This is how I typically knit. I try to demonstrate in my videos in both techniques. Whoop, I missed a strand. Of course, I'm using 2 strands of yarn here for my project. Hopefully for your first time doing this, you're using a single strand of yarn, because that just makes life a little easier. When you're dealing with 3 needles and 2 strands of yarn, it can be a little hectic. But here we go. I'm going to speed this up so you can see here at the end. You'll notice that stitch that I marked right there, but I happen to have 3 stitches remaining on each needle, so that marked stitch actually isn't anything of importance. So I'm binding off all these stitches. As I go, I get to the last stitch, work the last stitch on each needle together, bind off the final stitch from the right hand needle, then I'm going to cut the yarn and fasten off. And when I fasten off, I just pull that loop straight up and out. I don't tie any knots or pull the yarn through or anything like that. The last loop comes up and out. So that's my first side. What I'm going to do next is slide the stitches up the needle to access the second shoulders, and then begin that process again with the 3 needle bind off. So here they come up the needles with my working needle and working yarn. I'm going to begin that 3 needle bind off again for the other shoulder. And actually I like that I'm going in the same direction for both of these shoulders, so that the way the seam sits will be the same way on each shoulder, like it'll kind of lean towards the back on both shoulders. There will be some symmetry here. So here we go. I've started again. First stitch on each needle together. As soon as you have 2 stitches on your right hand needle, you begin binding off. So just speed things along here. Get to the end. Here we go. We're at the last couple stitches. Again, same as the other side. We work the last 2 stitches together. Pull the stitch over for bind off, fasten off the yarn, or cut the yarn first and then fasten off. Got a lot of tails here. And then I pull that loop straight up and out. And then this is the 3 needle bind off finished. Now that I've turned to the right side, I can see it. It's lovely. It's smooth. It's flexible. Can't wait to wear this sweater. My next step will be to pick up the stitches along the front and back bottom and work them in the round to create the body. I'm looking forward to that. Happy knitting. Thanks for watching.